We are 192 nations and countries, and we are like Speaker's Corner in London's Hyde Park. We just speak and nobody implements our decisions. We are mere decoration, without any real substance. We are Speaker's Corner, no more, no less. We just make speeches and then disappear. This is who you are right now. This statement from Muammar Gaddafi's speech at the 2009 United Nations General Assembly underscores the motivation behind the desire to remove him from power. The United Nations has faced extensive criticism from Africans, African leaders, and the entire developing world, with accusations that it serves the interests of a select few member states rather than the collective welfare of all its constituents. In reality, the United Nations was not established with the interests of African countries in mind. In 2017, during the 72nd General Assembly, Robert Mugabe, the then president of Zimbabwe, vehemently called for the reform of the United Nations. He stated, "The vision that we must present for a future United Nations should not be one filled with vague concepts that provide an opportunity for those states that seek to interfere in the internal affairs of other states." Concepts such as humanitarian intervention and the responsibility to protect need careful scrutiny in order to test the motives of their proponents. This statement by Mugabe takes us to the so-called humanitarian intervention in Libya that led to the death of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. This so-called intervention was just a disguise. It was a lie for NATO and co. to get rid of another African leader whom they saw as a big threat to their authority. In 2009, Muammar Gaddafi, who had ruled Libya for 42 years, delivered his first and only speech at the UN General Assembly. It raises concerns that a leader as outspoken as Gaddafi participated in the UN Assembly only once, although our focus today is not on this matter. During his speech, Gaddafi disregarded protocol by extending what was supposed to be a 15-minute address to a staggering 90 minutes. Following his initial greetings, he proceeded directly to the core of his message, making bold statements as he was renowned for. He said, "As is known, the United Nations was founded by 3 or 4 countries against Germany at the time. The United Nations was formed by the nations that joined together against Germany in the Second World War. Those countries formed a body called the Security Council, made its own countries permanent members, and granted them the power of veto. The United Nations Security Council comprises 15 members, with 5 permanent members and 10 elected by the General Assembly every 2 years. The permanent members hold veto power, enabling countries like the US, China, Russia, France, and the UK to individually block legally binding Security Council resolutions. Given their differing viewpoints, this often leads to inaction on urgent international crises. For instance, in the case of Syria, when the UN called for scaling back attacks in 2011, Russia and China vetoed the resolutions, supporting their ally, Bashar al-Assad. These vetoes hindered concrete action to end the deadly civil war. Similarly, Russia used its veto to stall investigations into the 2014 Malaysia Airlines crash over eastern Ukraine and blocked a resolution on Crimea's separation from Ukraine. Historically, the USSR led in vetoes until 1990, and since then, Russia has cast around 13 vetoes. The US has also used its veto power 79 times, primarily to oppose resolutions related to Israel, including recognizing a Palestinian state, acting against illegal settlements, and allowing expelled Palestinians to return. In total, there have been 263 vetoes since 1946, highlighting a significant challenge faced by the UN. Gaddafi went on and said, "We were not present at that time. The United Nations was shaped in line with those 3 countries and wanted us to step into shoes originally designed against Germany. That is the real substance of the United Nations when it was founded over 60 years ago." In this statement, Gaddafi highlighted the lack of representation in the early United Nations and the persistent disparity between the organization's ideals and the reality faced by many nations. When the UN was founded in 1945, only 4 African countries were founding members: Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa. However, the concept of independence for South Africa was deeply flawed due to the apartheid system, where the majority black population suffered under the rule of a minority white government. South Africa gained nominal independence in 1910, but this independence was marred by racial segregation and oppression. It wasn't until 1994, when apartheid ended, that South Africa achieved true independence. The UN, despite being created to serve the interests of all member states, failed to address the atrocities and inhuman acts committed within its own member state, South Africa. Furthermore, during the UN's founding, most African nations were still under colonial rule. Ghana gained independence in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, and Algeria in 1962. While the UN might have played a role in expediting the independence of these nations, the organization's effectiveness and commitment to the interests of newly independent states were questionable. Many aspects of these countries remained under the control of colonial powers like the UK and France, revealing a stark contrast between the UN's ideals and the realities faced by African nations at the time. Gaddafi, still on the creation of the UN, continues, "That happened in the absence of some 165 countries at a ratio of 1 to 8. That is, 1 was present and 8 were absent. They created the Charter, of which I have a copy. If one reads the Charter of the United Nations, one finds that the preamble of the Charter differs from its articles. How did it come into existence? All those who attended the San Francisco Conference in 1945 participated in creating the preamble, but they left the articles and internal rules of procedures of the so-called Security Council to experts, specialists, and interested countries, which were those countries that had established the Security Council and had united against Germany. The preamble is very appealing and no one objects to it, but all the provisions that follow it completely contradict the preamble. We reject such provisions, and we will never uphold them. They ended with the Second World War. The preamble says that all nations, small or large, are equal. Are we equal when it comes to the permanent seats? No. We are not equal. The preamble states in writing that all nations are equal whether they are small or large. Do we have the right of veto? Are we equal? The preamble says that we have equal rights, whether we are large or small. That is what is stated and what we agreed in the preamble. So the veto contradicts the Charter. The permanent seats contradict the Charter. We neither accept nor recognize the veto. What he stated holds undeniable truth. There is no falsehood in his words. Equality is absent in terms of veto power and the allocation of permanent seats. The 5 nations possessing veto power are perceived as superior, allowing them to exercise this authority as they see fit. Before we continue, if you find this video engaging, please show your support by liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. With that said, let's proceed. Gaddafi said, "The preamble of the Charter states that armed force shall not be used save in the common interest. That is the preamble that we agreed to and signed, and we joined the United Nations because we wanted the Charter to reflect that. It says that armed force shall only be used in the common interest of all nations, but what has happened since then? 65 wars have broken out since the establishment of the United Nations and the Security Council. 65 since their creation, with millions more victims than in the Second World War. Are those wars and the aggression and force that were used in those 65 wars in the common interest of us all? No, they were in the interest of 1 or 3 or 4 countries, but not of all nations. That flagrantly contradicts the Charter of the United Nations that we signed, and unless we act in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations to which we agreed, we will reject it and not be afraid not to speak diplomatically to anyone. Now we are talking about the future of the United Nations. There should be no hypocrisy or diplomacy because it concerns the important and vital issue of the future of the world. It was hypocrisy that brought about the 65 wars since the establishment of the United Nations. The preamble also states that if armed force is used, it must be a United Nations force. Thus, military intervention by the United Nations, with the joint agreement of the United Nations, not one or two or three countries using armed force. The entire United Nations will decide to go to war to maintain international peace and security. Since the establishment of the United Nations in 1945, if there is an act of aggression by one country against another, the entire United Nations should deter and stop that act. If a country, Libya for instance, were to exhibit aggression against France, then the entire organization would respond because France is a sovereign state member of the United Nations, and we all share the collective responsibility to protect the sovereignty of all nations. However, 65 aggressive wars have taken place without any United Nations action to prevent them. 8 other massive, fierce wars, whose victims number some 2 million, have been waged by member states that enjoy veto powers. Those countries that would have us believe they seek to maintain the sovereignty and independence of peoples actually use aggressive force against peoples. While we would like to believe that these countries want to work for peace and security in the world and protect peoples, they have instead resorted to aggressive wars and hostile behavior. Enjoying the veto they granted themselves as permanent members of the Security Council, they have initiated wars that have claimed millions of victims. The principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of states is enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. No country, therefore, has the right to interfere in the affairs of any government, be it democratic or dictatorial, socialist or capitalist, reactionary or progressive. This is the responsibility of each society. It is an internal matter for the people of the country concerned. The senators of Rome once appointed their leader Julius Caesar as dictator because it was good for Rome at that time. No one can say of Rome at that time that it gave Caesar the veto. The veto is not mentioned in the charter. We joined the United Nations because we thought we were equals, only to find that one country can object to all the decisions we make. Who gave the permanent members their status in the Security Council? 4 of them granted this status to themselves. The only country that we in this assembly elected to permanent member status in the Security Council is China. This was done democratically, but the other seats were imposed upon us undemocratically through a dictatorial procedure carried out against our will, and we should not accept it. He said, the United Nations need a total reform, and the reform is not to bring in more superpowers into the Security Council, as it will only cause chaos, he said. If we want to reform the United Nations, bringing in more superpowers is not the way. The solution is to foster democracy at the level of the General Congress of the world, the General Assembly, to which the powers of the Security Council should be transferred. The Security Council would become merely an instrument for implementing the decisions taken by the General Assembly, which would be the Parliament, the Legislative Assembly of the world. This assembly is our democratic forum, and the Security Council should be responsible before it. We should not accept the current situation. These are the legislators of the members of the United Nations, and their resolutions should be binding. It is said that the General Assembly should do whatever the Security Council recommends. On the contrary, the Security Council should do whatever the General Assembly decides. This is the United Nations, the assembly that includes 192 countries. It is not the Security Council, which includes only 15 of the member states. How can we be happy about global peace and security if the whole world is controlled by only 5 countries? We are 192 nations and countries, and we are like Speaker's Corner in London's Hyde Park. We just speak, and nobody implements our decisions. We are mere decoration, without any real substance. We are Speaker's Corner, no more, no less. We just make speeches and then disappear. This is who you are right now. Once the Security Council becomes only an executive body for resolutions adopted by the General Assembly, there will be no competition for membership of the Council. Once the Security Council becomes a tool to implement General Assembly resolutions, there will be no need for any competition. The Security Council should quite simply represent all nations. In accordance with the proposal submitted to the General Assembly, there would be permanent seats on the Security Council for all unions and groups of countries. The 27 countries of the European Union should have a permanent seat on the Security Council. The countries of the African Union should have a permanent seat on the Security Council. The Latin American and ASEAN countries should have permanent seats. The Russian Federation and the United States of America are already permanent members of the Security Council. The Southern African Development Community, SADC, once it is fully established, should have a permanent seat. The 22 countries of the Arab League should have a permanent seat. The 57 countries of the Islamic Conference should have a permanent seat. The 118 countries of the non-aligned movement should have a permanent seat. Then there is the G100. Perhaps the small countries should also have a permanent seat. Countries not included in the unions that I have mentioned could perhaps be assigned a permanent seat, to be occupied by them in rotation every 6 or 12 months. I am thinking of countries like Japan and Australia that are outside such organizations as ASEAN, or like the Russian Federation that is not a member of the European or Latin American or African unions. This would be a solution for them if the General Assembly votes in favor of it. The issue is a vitally important one. As has already been mentioned, the General Assembly is the Congress and Parliament of the world, the leader of the world. We are the nations, and anyone outside this General Assembly will not be recognized. The President of the Assembly, Mr. Ali Abdusalam Treki, and Secretary General Ban Ki-moon will produce the legal draft and set up the necessary committees to submit this proposal to a vote, that from now on the Security Council will be made up of unions of nations. In this way, we will have justice and democracy, and we will no longer have a Security Council consisting of countries which have been chosen because they have nuclear weapons, large economies, or advanced technology. That is terrorism. We cannot allow the Security Council to be run by superpowers. That is terrorism in and of itself. If we want a world that is united, safe, and peaceful, this is what we should do. Otherwise, we will continue to have conflict and fight until doomsday or the end of the world. All Security Council members should have the right to exercise the veto, or else we should eliminate the whole concept of the veto with this new formation of the Council. This would be a real Security Council. According to the new proposals submitted to the General Assembly, it will be an Executive Council under the control of the General Assembly, which will have the real power and make all the rules. In this way, all countries will be on an equal footing in the Security Council, just as they are in the General Assembly. In the General Assembly, we are all treated equally when it comes to membership and voting. It should be the same in the Security Council. Currently, one country has a veto. Another country does not have a veto. One country has a permanent seat. Another country does not have a permanent seat. We should not accept this, nor should we accept any resolution adopted by the Security Council in its current composition. We were under trusteeship, we were colonized, and now we are independent. We are here today to decide the future of the world in a democratic way that will maintain the peace and security of all nations, large and small, as equals. Otherwise, it is terrorism. For terrorism is not just Al-Qaeda, but can also take other forms. We should be guided by the majority of the votes in the General Assembly alone. If the General Assembly takes a decision by voting, then its wishes should be obeyed and its decision should be enforced. No one is above the General Assembly. Anyone who says he is above the assembly should leave the United Nations and be on his own. Democracy is not for the rich or the most powerful or for those who practice terrorism. All nations should be and should be seen to be on an equal footing. At present, the Security Council is security feudalism, political feudalism for those with permanent seats, protected by them and used against us. It should be called not the Security Council, but the Terror Council. In our political life, if they need to use the Security Council against us, they turn to the Security Council. If they have no need to use it against us, they ignore the Security Council. If they have an interest to promote, an axe to grind, they respect and glorify the Charter of the United Nations. They turn to Chapter 7 of the Charter and use it against poor nations. If, however, they wished to violate the Charter, they would ignore it as if it did not exist at all. If the veto of the permanent members of the Security Council is given to those who have the power, this is injustice and terrorism and should not be tolerated by us. We should not live in the shadow of this injustice and terror. Superpowers have complicated global interests, and they use the veto to protect those interests. For example, in the Security Council, they use the power of the United Nations to protect their interests and to terrorize and intimidate the Third World, causing it to live under the shadow of terror. From the beginning, since it was established in 1945, the Security Council has failed to provide security. On the contrary, it has provided terror and sanctions. It is only used against us. For this reason, we will no longer be committed to implementing Security Council resolutions after this speech. If they want to keep their permanent seats, that is fine. Permanent seats will be of no concern to us. We shall never submit to their control or to their exercise of the veto that was given to them. We are not so foolish as to give the right of veto to the superpowers to use so they can treat us as second-class citizens and as outcast nations. It is not we who decided that those countries are the superpowers and respected nations with the power to act on behalf of 192 countries. You should be fully aware that we are ignoring the Security Council resolutions because those resolutions are used solely against us and not against the superpowers which have the permanent seats and the right of veto. Those powers never use any resolutions against themselves. They are, however, used against us. Such use has turned the United Nations into a travesty of itself and has generated wars and violations of the sovereignty of independent states. It has led to war crimes and genocides. All of this is in violation of the Charter of the United Nations. After expressing these points, Gaddafi further emphasized that regardless of whether the United Nations undergoes reform or not, Africa must be granted a permanent seat in the Security Council, he said. Regarding Africa, Mr. President, whether the United Nations is reformed or not, and even before a vote is taken on any proposals of a historic nature, Africa should be given a permanent seat on the Security Council now, having already waited too long. Leaving aside United Nations reform, we can certainly say that Africa was colonized, isolated, and persecuted, and its rights usurped. Its people were enslaved and treated like animals, and its territory was colonized and placed under trusteeship. The countries of the African Union deserve a permanent seat. This is a debt from the past that has to be paid and has nothing to do with United Nations reform. It is a priority matter and is high on the agenda of the General Assembly. No one can say that the African Union does not deserve a permanent seat. Who can argue with this proposal? I challenge anyone to make a case against it. Where is the proof that the African Union or the African continent does not deserve a permanent seat? No one can possibly deny this. This speech is said to be the major reason, among others, why Gaddafi was targeted and killed. The intervention in Libya led by NATO was said no to be primarily motivated by concerns about war or crimes against humanity. Their main objective was to remove him from power at any expense. They achieved this by disseminating false information that was embraced not only by the global community, but especially by Libyans and Africans. And overall, it was approved by the UN. What do you think about this? Let's know in the comments. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so as to get notified once we upload a new video.